The winter wheat had failed by the second freeze, and the rye followed soon after. The ground lay pale and crusted, the color of old bone, stretching out from her cabin door to the far fence line where the prairie began its long, patient roll toward nothing. She had watched it all autumn, the way a woman watches a clock that has stopped, knowing it will not start again but looking anyway. Her hands were raw from hauling water that froze before the bucket reached the barn. Her boots had cracked at the seams, and the flour in the bin would last another month if she was careful, and 2 weeks if she was not. She was 43 years old and had buried 2 husbands and 1 child, and the soil she had staked her whole remaining hope on had turned against her like a betrayed friend. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, not the ones painted on canvas or celebrated in brass bands, but the quiet ones, the ones carried in calloused hands and spoken low beside a dying fire. Today we travel to the Dakota Territory in the bitter spring of 1887, to a woman named Ada Whitaker, who stood at the edge of her own ruin and chose to plant something that everyone else called foolishness. Her neighbors laughed. The land agent wrote her off. The soil itself seemed to have given up. But Ada had learned something from the one man in the territory who still knew how to listen to the ground. And what she did next would save not only her farm, but a way of living that the plains were determined to destroy. So sit close and let the fire settle. This one takes time to unfold. Ada Whitaker had come to the Dakota Territory in the spring of 1883, 8 years after the death of her first husband and 3 years after she lost her second. She had no children living, no family left in Ohio, and a homestead claim that had looked promising on paper but had turned out to be 16 acres of exhausted topsoil that had been cropped to death by 3 previous owners before she ever set foot on it. The cabin was sound enough, a single room with a loft, a stove that drew well, and a window that faced south. But the land itself was a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Every season she planted corn, and every season the stalks came up thin and yellow, the ears small and stunted, the yield shrinking year by year until she could no longer pretend that next year would be different. She had written letters to the land office, to her sister in Ohio, to a seed merchant in Sioux Falls who had sold her a mix he swore would thrive on worn ground. Nothing helped. The ground had been asked too many times, too hard, and it had nothing left to give. By the winter of 1886, she had stopped writing letters. She had stopped hoping for a different answer from the soil. She measured her remaining stores each morning and evening, not out of hope but out of discipline, the way a person counts the last coins in a purse they know is nearly empty. She mended the holes in her only wool dress by lamplight, using thread she had unraveled from a flour sack, and she did not allow herself to think about what would happen when the thread ran out. It was in that winter, on a night when the wind drove snow against the window in a steady, low howl, that she heard the knock at her door. The old man standing on her step was named Einar Holt. He was 81 years old and had lived on the same claim for 53 of them, and he had not come to visit a neighbor in more than a decade. His beard was white, his shoulders were bent, and he carried a wooden crate in his arms as though it held something heavier than wood. Ada let him in without a word because the cold was too sharp for questions, and because something in his face told her that he had been walking a long time to get here. She set the kettle on the stove, and when the water was hot, she poured him a cup and sat across from him at the table and waited. He set the crate down between them and opened the lid to reveal 2 things: a thick canvas sack tied with twine and a journal bound in black leather, the corners worn white with age. "This is all I got left," he said, his voice slow and careful, the accent of a man who had learned English late and never quite trusted it. 53 years on this ground, and this is what I saved: the seed and the book. I got nobody to give it to. He pushed the crate toward her. "You got the look of a woman who don't give up easy. That's why I come." Ada did not open the journal then. She did not ask what the seed was. She was too tired for hope, and too acquainted with disappointment to invite it inside. But she did not send him away either. She sat across from him while he drank his tea, and when he left, She carried the crate to the corner of the cabin and set it beside her bed, and she did not touch it again for 2 weeks. The journal sat on the crate, and the crate sat on the floor, and every morning when she woke, her eyes fell on it before they found the window. She would look at it for a moment, then rise, dress, and go out to face another day of frost and silence and the slow defeat of walking ground that gave nothing back. But the journal was there, patient as an unanswered question, and late one night, when the wind had died and the cabin was warm from the stove, she opened it. The handwriting was small and precise, the letters formed with a care that belonged to a man who had learned to write in a language not his own and valued every stroke. Einar Holt had kept the journal for 40 years, recording the weather, the soil conditions, the yields, the failures, and the one discovery that had saved his own farm when he was younger than Ada was now. He had planted red clover. Not for harvest, not for sale, not for any immediate return. He had planted it as a gift to the ground itself. He wrote about the roots, how they reached deep and fine, how the nodules along them captured something from the air and stored it in the soil. He wrote about the earthworms that came back after the clover was turned under, how they tunneled and aerated and left behind a richness that no amount of manure could match. He wrote about the corn that followed, how it stood so tall that a man could walk beneath the eaves of it and feel the stalk brush his shoulders on either side. Ada read the journal straight through, from the first entry in 1847 to the last, written in a hand grown unsteady, dated only 2 years before. She read it by lamplight until the oil ran low, then by the glow of the stove, then by the first gray light of morning through the window. And when she finished, she sat still for a long time, the journal open in her hands, and she thought about what it meant to trust a thing you could not yet see. She had never planted clover. She had never known anyone who had. The storekeeper in Willow Creek would laugh if she ordered it, and the men who drove the supply wagons would talk about her all the way back to town. But the journal was not theory. Einar Holt had done it. He had watched his own ruined ground come back to life, and he had walked 3 miles through a winter storm to put that knowledge into her hands. That morning she hitched the horse to the wagon, drove 12 miles to Willow Creek, and spent her last $2 on a bag of red clover seed. The storekeeper, a man named Harold Pruitt, sold it to her without comment, but she saw the way his eyebrows lifted when she told him what she meant to do. He did not say anything, not then, but word traveled fast on the prairie, and by the time she got home, the news had already reached her neighbors. The planting came in the first week of April, when the ground had thawed enough to take the seed, but was still cold and reluctant beneath the surface. Ada walked the 16 acres of her south field, the canvas sack slung over her shoulder, scattering the tiny red seeds by hand in wide, sweeping arcs. She walked the length of the field and back, and then she walked it again, row by row, until every grain was in the ground. The wind carried some of it, but she did not worry. The soil would take what it needed, and the rest would find its own way. She had not been at it for an hour before the first wagon slowed on the road. It was Harold Pruitt himself, coming back from a delivery to the north, and he pulled his team to a stop and sat looking at her for a long moment before he spoke. "What in heaven's name are you planting, Ada?" he called across the fence. She straightened and turned, the sack weighing on her hip. "Red clover," she said. He stared at her. Then he laughed, not loudly, but with the particular sound of a man who has just had his worst suspicion confirmed. "You're planting flowers on a farm, on ground that won't even grow corn." She did not answer. She turned back to her work and continued scattering the seed, and she heard him click his tongue to the team and drive on, the sound of his wagon fading down the road. That night she wrote in the journal she had begun keeping, a plain composition book bought with 2 pennies earned from mending a coat for a woman in town. She wrote, "The seed is in, the ground is cold, but Einar Holt said it would work, and he is the only man I know who never lied to me." The clover came up slow, the way all honest things do. For 3 weeks after planting, the south field showed nothing but the same pale, tired soil. Ada checked it each morning, kneeling at the edge, pressing her hand flat against the ground as though she could feel the seed waiting beneath. The wind blew, the frost lingered, and the field remained silent. And then, on a morning in late April, she walked out to find a faint green haze spread across the far quarter of the field, so thin and low that she almost thought it was a trick of light. She knelt and ran her fingers across it, and the tiny leaves bent and rose again, soft as velvet, green as hope. She sat there for a long time, not moving, the sun warming her back, and she listened to the wind moving through the new growth, and she whispered to herself, very softly, "It's alive." The dry spell came in June, as it always did on the plains, and the clover slowed but did not stop. The roots had gone deep, deeper than corn ever did, and they found what water the ground still held. The field turned from pale green to deep, rich emerald, and by July it was a solid carpet of red blossoms, humming with bees. Ada walked through it barefoot one evening, the thick clover cool against her skin, and she thought she could feel the difference in the soil beneath her feet. It was softer, darker. She brought a handful of it to her nose and smelled something rich and living, something she had not smelled since she was a girl on her father's farm in Ohio, before the land had been used up and abandoned. She wrote in her journal that night, "The south field smells like earth again, not dust, not ash, earth. I almost don't know what to do with that." Her neighbors drove past without stopping, and those who did slow down did not laugh the way Harold Pruitt had laughed. They looked at the field, and then they looked at her, and then they drove on, their silence carrying its own kind of judgment. She did not mind. She had learned to read what the soil told her, and the soil was telling her something that no word from a storekeeper could touch. By late August, when the clover had gone to seed and the blossoms faded to brown, she went to see Einar Holt. She found him in his barn, too weak to rise from his cot, his eyes clouded but still sharp when they found her face. She knelt beside him and told him what the field looked like, how the clover had grown, how the soil had darkened, how the bees had come. He listened, and he smiled, a thin crack in his weathered face. "Good," he said. "Now you turn it under, before the frost. You give it all back." She nodded, and she took his hand, and she held it for a long moment. She buried Einar Holt on the first day of October, in a corner of his own land overlooking the creek he had claimed more than half a century before. The next morning, she hitched the horse to the plow and walked into the south field. The clover stood thick and tall, the stems tough from the summer's sun, and the soil beneath it had changed. She could feel it in the way the plow bit into it, in the dark, rich curl of earth that rose behind the blade, in the smell that came off it, deep and loamy and alive. She turned every row, the work stretching from dawn until dusk, and when she finished, she stood at the edge of the field and looked out at the long, dark ribbons of turned earth, and she knew that something had begun. Harold Pruitt came by that evening, driving past on his way home from town. He slowed, and this time he did not laugh. He looked at the plowed field, and then he looked at her, and he said, "You really think that's going to grow something next year?" Ada wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and met his eyes. "I don't think," she said. "I know." He sat there for a moment, then shook his head and drove on. The wheels of his wagon creaked in the quiet, and the sound faded into the distance. Ada turned back to the field. The sun was setting behind her, and the turned earth caught the last light, dark and patient and full of promise. She stood still, listening, and she heard the wind moving over the prairie, and underneath it, something else, a sound she had not heard in years, the ground breathing. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets, and stay by the fire a little longer. Because Ada Whitaker was not done yet. The winter would test her, and the spring would bring a reckoning, and the neighbors who had laughed would remember her name. But that night she walked back to her cabin, and she lit the lamp, and she opened the journal Einar Holt had given her, and she began to write. Outside, the prairie gathered its darkness, and the field held its secret, and the year turned toward the cold. The winter of 1887 came down on the Dakota Territory like a door slamming shut. Ada Whitaker had known hard winters before. She had buried a child in one and a husband in another. But this one seemed to have a particular weight to it, as though the sky itself had decided to test how much a woman could carry before she set it down. The snow began in November and did not let up. It piled against the cabin walls until the lower half of the window was buried, and she had to dig a path to the barn each morning, the shovel handle slick with frost, her breath freezing on the wool wrapped around her face. The woodpile shrank faster than she had calculated, and she learned to burn sparingly, letting the fire die down at night and waking to find her breath visible in the dark. Pearl, her milk cow, grew thin despite the hay she had stored, and the milk thinned with her. Ada measured each day by the small arithmetic of survival. 3 logs left, 2 cups of flour, 1 egg from the hen that still laid. She did not let herself think about the south field. The clover had been turned under in October, and now it lay beneath 2 feet of snow, doing whatever it was that soil did in the deep cold. She trusted it, or she tried to. Trust, she had learned, was not the same as certainty. It was a decision made over and over, without proof. Word traveled slow in winter, but it traveled nonetheless. Harold Pruitt had carried the story of her red clover planting to every farm between Willow Creek and the river, and by the time the snow had settled, the entire settlement knew that Ada Whitaker had spent her last money on flowers. The laughter had a longer reach than the cold. She heard it secondhand when she went to town for supplies, in the way conversation stopped when she entered the general store, in the way Pruitt handed her change without meeting her eyes. She did not defend herself. There was nothing to defend. The ground would speak when it was ready. In late February, a thaw came, brief and treacherous. The snow turned to slush, and the roads became rivers of mud, and Ada used the brake to walk the perimeter of the south field. The ground was soft and dark, and where the snow had melted in patches, she could see the surface had changed. It was no longer the pale, crusted gray she had known. It was brown, almost black, and when she knelt and pressed her fingers into it, it crumbled easily, the way she remembered soil from her father's best garden. She stayed there for a long time, her hands on the earth, and she felt something rise in her chest that she had not felt in years. Not hope, exactly, something quieter, something that did not need a name. She planted the corn on the 15th of April, the earliest date she dared. The field had been prepared over the previous week, the turned clover now decomposed into the soil, and she harrowed it with a borrowed drag that she pulled behind the horse in long, steady passes. The seed was a variety called Eureka White, a dent corn known for hardiness, and she had bought it with money earned from mending a harness for a neighbor who had lost his wife the year before, a man named Caleb Sutter, who paid in coin because he did not know what else to do with his grief. She planted by hand, dropping 4 kernels to a hill, spacing the hills 3 feet apart, the way her father had taught her in another life. The soil closed over the seed with a soft, dark acceptance, and she tamped each hill with the flat of her boot. And she did not pray because she had stopped believing that prayer changed the order of things. But she did whisper to the ground, to the seed, to the memory of Einar Holt. Grow. The germination came fast, faster than she had expected. Within 8 days, the first green spikes broke the surface, and within 2 weeks, the field was covered in a low, even carpet of leaves. She walked the rows each morning, counting, measuring, writing in her journal. The corn grew quickly, the stalks thickening in a way she had not seen on this land before. By the end of May, the plants were knee-high. By the middle of June, they reached her waist. She ran her hand along the broad leaves, and they were dark green, almost blue in the morning light, and the stems were thick and firm, the color of healthy things. The neighbors noticed. They could not help noticing. The south field was visible from the road, and anyone driving past could see that Ada Whitaker's corn was different. It was taller, darker, more vigorous than anything in the surrounding miles. Caleb Sutter, the widower, stopped by one evening in early June, leading his horse, and stood at the fence line without speaking for a full minute. Then he said, "What did you do to that ground?" Ada told him about the clover, about Einar Holt's journal, about the 2 seasons of patience. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he nodded slowly. "I got a field that's gone thin," he said, "same as yours was. Would you sell me some of that seed?" She gave him a handful of clover seed from the sack she had saved, and he took it the way a man takes something sacred, cupped in both hands. The mockery did not stop, not entirely. There were still those who shook their heads, who said that one good season did not prove anything, that the ground would go back to what it was. that Ada had been lucky, and luck never lasted. The loudest of these was a man named Orville Grimes, the land agent who had visited her the previous summer. He was a tall, narrow man with a voice that carried authority the way a dry creek bed carries the memory of water, more shape than substance. He had written a report on her claim that fall, recommending that the government consider forfeiture on grounds of insufficient improvement. The report had been delayed by winter, but he came out in person on a warm morning in July, riding a bay mare up to her cabin with a leather satchel and a look of settled certainty on his face. He did not dismount. He sat in the saddle, looking down at her, and he said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I've come to inspect the claim. The office will want a full accounting by August." She looked up at him, squinting against the sun, and she said, "Then you'd better see the corn." She led him to the south field, and she watched his face when he saw it. The corn was shoulder-high now, the ears beginning to fill. The field a dense green wall that blocked the view of the fence. He sat his horse at the edge, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is the same ground I saw last year, the same field?" She nodded. He dismounted and walked a few steps into the field, parting the stalks with his hands. He pulled an ear down and peeled back the husk, examining the developing kernels. He did not say anything for a while. Then he turned back to her, and his face had not softened, but something in his voice had shifted. "I'll write my report," he said. "But I'll note what I see here." He mounted his horse, and he rode away without another word. That night, Ada sat on her porch as the sun went down, watching the light fade over the corn. She was tired, her back aching from the day's labor, her hands calloused and cracked. But there was a sound coming from the field that she had never heard before. It was the rustle of the corn leaves in the wind, but underneath it, the sound of the stalks themselves, creaking and settling as they grew. She closed her eyes, and she listened, and she remembered what Einar Holt had written in the margin of his journal, in ink that had faded to a pale brown. "The corn will tell you when it is content. It will sing to itself at dusk." She opened her eyes and looked out over the field, and she thought she could hear it, a low, soft hum, not from insects, but from the plants themselves, the sound of living things doing what they were made to do. The drought began in the third week of July. It came without warning, as it always did on the plains. One day the sky was heavy with clouds that promised rain, and the next the clouds were gone, and a wind came down from the north, hot and dry, that sucked the moisture from everything it touched. The grass turned brown in a matter of days. The creeks shrank to muddy trickles. The soil on the fields that had not been improved cracked into wide, dry fissures, and the corn on every farm within 20 miles began to wilt. The leaves curled, the stalks drooped, and the ears stopped filling. Ada watched the drought settle over her land with a stillness that surprised her. She had seen drought before, had watched her first husband's wheat wither in a single August, had stood helpless while the crop that was supposed to save them turned to dust. But this time, she did not feel the same panic. She walked to the south field and knelt, and she dug her hand into the soil. It was warm on the surface, but 6 inches down, it was cool and damp. The clover roots had done their work. The soil held moisture the way a good wool blanket holds heat, slow and steady. She stayed on her knees, her hand buried in the earth, and she listened to the corn. It was not singing now. The heat had silenced that. But the stalks were still green, still standing, still reaching for the sky. Harold Pruitt came by on the 5th day of the drought. His wagon loaded with empty barrels he was hauling to the river. He stopped at the edge of the south field, and he stared at the corn. And then he said, without looking at Ada, "Mine's gone." He pointed north, toward his land. 3 acres of field corn, all of it. The leaves are curling like paper. I watered it from the well, but there ain't enough. There's never enough. He looked at her then, and his eyes were red-rimmed and tired. "How is yours still standing?" Ada told him about the clover again, about the roots that had opened the soil, about the earthworms that had tunneled and aerated and left behind channels for water to seep into. She told him how the organic matter held moisture like a sponge, how the soil did not bake into hard clay in the sun. He listened, and he said nothing. But before he drove on, he said, "I could use some of that clover seed. If you got any left." The drought lasted 18 days. By the end of it, the prairie was the color of straw, and the air was heavy with dust, and the neighbors' corn was a total loss. Some of them had tried to irrigate from wells that ran dry. Others had given up and turned their cattle into the fields to salvage what they could from the failed stalks. But Ada Whitaker's south field stood green. The corn was not as tall as it would have been in a wet season. The ears were smaller. A few of the lower leaves had yellowed, but it was alive. It was harvestable. She walked through it on the morning of the first rain, when the clouds finally broke and the water came down in a steady, gentle pour. And she stood in the middle of the field with her face turned up, letting the rain soak through her dress, feeling the soil beneath her feet soften and receive. She harvested in early September, pulling the ears by hand, shucking them in the field, filling the wagon until the wheels groaned. The yield was not the best she had ever seen, but it was more than she needed to feed herself through the winter, more than enough to pay the taxes, more than enough to buy seed for the next season. She stored the corn in the barn, dried it on the cob, and she wrote in her journal, "The ground kept its promise. I will not forget this." Orville Grimes returned in October, not on horseback this time, but in a buggy, with a woman sitting beside him. She was thin and gray-haired, with hands that were never still, and she introduced herself as Mrs. Elvira Holt, Einar Holt's niece, who had come from Minnesota to settle his affairs. Ada received them at the table, and Mrs. Holt set a letter on the wood between them. It was from Einar, written 2 years before his death, and it said that if anyone found a way to make the land give again, they should have his journal and his name. Mrs. Holt looked at Ada with an expression that was not quite a smile. "He wrote about you," she said, "in his last letter to me. Said there was a woman on the South Road who listened to the ground. He said that was the highest thing he could call a person." Ada did not know what to say to that. She set the letter back on the table and folded her hands. Outside, the south field lay bare, the corn harvested, the stalks cut and baled for winter feed. The soil was dark and quiet, resting for the next season. Mrs. Holt stayed for supper, and before she left, she took Ada's hands in both of hers and held them. "He would be proud," she said. "He would say you heard what he was trying to say, and that's all he ever wanted." That winter was not as cold as the one before. The snow came late, and the wind was gentler, and Ada slept through more nights than she woke from. She wrote in her journal less often now, because the days were full of small, steady work, and the urgency had gone out of her. But she still walked to the south field on clear mornings, even when the snow covered it. She would stand at the fence line, her hands in her pockets, and she would look at the white expanse, knowing what lay beneath it. The ground was not empty. It was gathering, waiting, getting ready. In the spring of 1888, she planted corn again. The field was ready, the soil dark and rich, and the seed she used was saved from the best ears of the previous harvest. The planting went faster this time because she knew what she was doing, and the earth received the seed like a woman opening her arms to a child. She planted clover on a fallow strip along the west edge, and she began to set aside a portion of each harvest to share with neighbors who wanted to try the method. Caleb Sutter came to help her harrow, and he brought his daughter, a girl of 12, who had her mother's quiet eyes. The girl asked if she could scatter the clover seed on their own field, and Ada said yes. The corn grew under a sky that did not hold back its rain. The summer was generous, the soil forgiving, and the harvest that fall was the best Ada had ever pulled from any piece of ground. She filled the barn to the rafters, and she sold the surplus to the mill in Willow Creek, and she paid off every debt she owed. She bought a new stove, and a second milk cow, and a bolt of good wool cloth that she used to make a dress that fit her properly for the first time in years. One evening in October, as she stood at the edge of the south field, watching the sun set behind the stubble, she heard a wagon on the road. It was Harold Pruitt, and he pulled up and sat holding the reins, not looking at her. He cleared his throat. "Ada," he said, and he stopped. He tried again. "I was wrong about the clover," he said. His voice cracked. He did not say anything more. He did not need to. Ada walked to the wagon and put her hand on the rail. She said, "I have seed. You can have all you need. He nodded, and he drove on. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets, and stay by the fire a little longer. Because Ada Whitaker had learned something that the soil could not teach alone. She had learned that the ground keeps its promise only when someone keeps theirs first. And the winter that lay ahead would test her faith in ways she had not yet imagined. The corn was in the barn, the accounts were settled, but the land itself was not done speaking to her. There was another lesson waiting in the deep cold, something that even Einar Holt had not written down, and it would come to her not through a journal, but through a voice from the prairie that she had not heard before. The spring of 1889 came in soft and wet, the kind of season that made a woman believe the land had forgiven everything. Ada Whitaker planted her corn in the second week of April, the soil warm enough to receive the seed, the sky holding a pale, patient light that promised nothing and delivered everything. The field had been prepared with care, the clover from the previous fall turned under in November. The winter cover of rye that she had learned to plant on the advice of Einar Holt's journal now mown and tilled back into the earth. She worked the ground with a borrowed disc harrow, and the soil broke apart in dark, crumbly clods that smelled of damp wool and growing things. The seed went in clean, and the rains came on schedule, and by the 1st of May, the field was covered in a dense, even stand of corn that reached her knee by the end of the month. But success on the prairie did not buy peace. The more Ada's corn grew, the louder the whispers became. They came from the women at the church social, from the men who gathered at Pruitt's store on Saturday afternoons, from the children who repeated what they heard at home. The whispers had a shape now, and a name. They said Ada Whitaker had been lucky once, but luck did not last. They said the ground would remember its true nature and betray her. They said she was prideful, that she had taken a dead man's secret and used it to elevate herself above honest farmers who had worked the same soil for decades without complaint. The kindest of them said she had been fortunate in the drought, and that fortune was not the same as skill. The loudest voice belonged not to a man this time, but to a woman named Hilda Mears. She was the wife of a prosperous wheat farmer who held 200 acres to the northeast, and she had built her reputation on the certainty that hard work and discipline were the only tools a person needed to succeed. She had watched Ada's rise with a tightening around her mouth that deepened week by week. Hilda Mears was not cruel by nature, or not entirely, but she was threatened by anything that suggested her own methods might be incomplete. She began to speak at the quilting circle, at the Wednesday prayer meeting, at the women's auxiliary gatherings, where Ada could not defend herself because she was not invited. The words spread. Red clover is a cure for nothing but laziness. Real farmers grow corn. Real farmers don't waste a season on weeds. Ada heard about it from the one friend she had made in those years, a young woman named Martha Sutter, the daughter of Caleb Sutter, the widower who had taken her clover seed and planted it on his own thin ground. Martha was 16 now, with steady hands and a quiet, observant way of moving through the world. She came to Ada's cabin one evening in early June, bringing a basket of early peas and a piece of news that she did not want to carry. "Mrs. Mears is telling everyone that you bought your clover seed from a traveling salesman, and that Einar Holt never existed," Martha said, her voice low and careful. "She says you made up the journal to cover up the fact that you were gifted the land by a man who had no heirs." Ada set down the knife she was using to trim the wick of the lamp. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she laughed. Not a bitter laugh, but the laugh of a woman who has been tested by worse things than gossip and found herself still standing. "Let her talk," Ada said. "The ground does not care what Hilda Mears says. The corn does not listen to rumors." But even as she said it, she felt the weight of the words settling around her shoulders. She had faced mockery before, from Harold Pruitt and from Orville Grimes. But those had been the mockery of men, direct and open, something she could meet with her eyes and answer with her hands. The mockery of women was different. It moved through the community like water through cracks, and it could not be stopped by a plow or a good harvest. The summer that followed was a test of everything Ada had learned. The rain stopped in July, as they had the year before, but this time the drought was not the enemy. The enemy was expectation. Every eye in the county was on her south field, and every conversation about the weather circled back to her. Would her corn hold again? Or had last year been a fluke? The men who had driven past without stopping now slowed to a crawl, studying her field the way a doctor studies a patient with a questionable diagnosis. Ada walked her rows each morning and evening, feeling the soil crumble under her boots, watching the leaves for any sign of yellowing or curl. The corn stood tall and green, the ears filling with a slow, steady determination that matched her own. But she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched, not with admiration, but with a hunger for failure. It was Martha who brought the news of Orville Grimes's new report. He had written to the Territorial Land Office, recommending that Ada's claim be reviewed for possible reduction. The reason he gave was not the quality of the land, but the quantity. He argued that a single woman did not need 16 acres when 8 would suffice, and that the remaining 8 should be open to a new claimant who would put it to more productive use. The report had been written in March, but it had been delayed in the mail, and it was only now, in July, that Ada received a copy of it, handed to her by the postwriter with an apologetic shrug. She read it standing on her porch, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. The report did not mention the clover. It did not mention the drought. It mentioned only her gender and the size of her claim, as though these two facts were sufficient to undo everything she had built. She wrote a letter that night, a careful, measured response that stated the facts of her improvement: the 16 acres of corn, the soil restoration, the yield records, the testimony of neighbors who had benefited from her seed. She sent it to the land office with a copy of Einar Holt's journal entry on Clover, and she waited. The weeks passed. The corn grew. The ears filled, and no answer came. By August, the heat had settled into a steady, oppressive weight that pressed down on the prairie like a hand on a held breath. The corn in Ada's field was now taller than a man on horseback, the stalks thick as her wrist, the leaves broad and dark. She walked through it one afternoon, the green walls closing around her, and she found a place in the center of the field where the corn formed a natural clearing, a small room of shade and silence. She sat down in the dirt, her back against a stalk, and she closed her eyes. She had not realized how tired she was, not from the labor which she had always carried, but from the weight of being watched, judged, doubted. She sat there for a long time, listening to the corn. It did not sing that day. It only rustled, the way a patient friend might shift in their seat, waiting for you to speak. She was still there when she heard the footsteps, a rustle in the corn, not the wind, but something heavier. She opened her eyes and saw a figure approaching through the stalks. It was a man she did not recognize, tall and lean, with a beard that needed trimming, and eyes that had the unsettled look of someone who had been traveling too long. He stopped when he saw her, and he held up his hands, palms open, to show he meant no harm. "I'm sorry to intrude, ma'am," he said. "I saw the corn from the road. I had to see it for myself." He introduced himself as Thomas Meeks, a farmer from the Nebraska border who had heard rumors of a woman in the Dakota Territory who could grow corn on dead ground. He had ridden 3 days to find her. Ada rose, brushing the dirt from her skirt. She did not know whether to feel flattered or exposed. She led him out of the field and to the cabin, where she poured him water and listened to his story. His land was failing, the same way hers had failed. He had tried everything he could afford, and he was down to his last season before the bank took the claim. He had heard about the clover from a freight driver who had passed through Willow Creek, and he had come to see if it was true. Ada showed him the journal. She told him the whole story, from Einar Holt's visit to the first planting to the drought that had confirmed everything. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he sat back in his chair and stared at the wall for a long time. Then he said, "I have a bag of red clover seed in my saddlebag. I bought it on the way. I was afraid to plant it because everyone I asked said it was foolish, but I bought it anyway." Ada went to her shelf and took down the sack of clover seed she had saved from the previous year. She handed it to him, and she said, "Plant it this fall, after the harvest. Let it grow through the next season. Turn it under before frost, and then trust the ground." He took the sack, and he held it the way a drowning man holds a rope. He stayed that night, sleeping in the barn, and in the morning he rode south with the seed tied to his saddle. Ada watched him go, and she wondered how many others were out there, holding bags of seed they were afraid to plant, waiting for permission to believe in something they could not yet see. The harvest that fall was good, though not as abundant as the previous year. The drought had taken a toll, and the earlier planting had been delayed by a cold snap in April that had stunted a quarter of the field. But the yield was still respectable, enough to fill the barn and pay the taxes and leave a little extra for the winter. Ada sold her surplus at the mill in Willow Creek, and she used the money to buy a new harness for the horse and a new pair of boots for herself. She was walking home from town, the new boots on her feet, when she met Hilda Mears on the road. Hilda was driving a buggy, alone, and she pulled up when she saw Ada. The two women regarded each other in the late afternoon light. Hilda's face was tight, her hands gripping the reins. "I heard you had a visitor from Nebraska," she said. Ada said nothing. "I heard you gave him clover seed." Ada still said nothing. Hilda's voice was higher than it had been, a thin edge of something that might have been fear. "You think you're saving the land, but you're just filling people's heads with stories. It won't last. It can't last. The ground will go back to what it was, and then where will you be?" Ada looked at her, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not anger, not pity, something quieter, a recognition. She said, "Hilda, when was the last time you put your hands in the soil and did not ask it for something?" Hilda stared at her. The question hung in the air between them, unanswered. Hilda clicked her tongue to the horse and drove on, and Ada stood on the road, watching the buggy disappear into the dust, and she thought about the look on Hilda's face. It was not hatred. It was something worse. It was the look of a woman who had never been taught that the ground could give without being taken from. That night, Ada sat at her table and opened the journal Einar Holt had given her. She turned to the last page, where he had written, in handwriting that was barely legible, a single sentence: "The soil does not keep account of what it owes. It gives because that is what it is made to do." She read it 3 times, and then she closed the book, and she went to bed. But she did not sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind move across the prairie, and she felt something coming, not toward her, but toward the land itself. A change in the air, a shift in the pressure, a stillness that was not peace but the calm before a storm. The first frost came on the 23rd of October, nearly a full month earlier than the average. It caught everyone by surprise. The wheat harvest was still in the fields on most farms, and the men who had planted late found their crops flattened and blackened overnight. Ada's corn had been harvested 2 weeks before, and the stalks had been cut and baled for winter feed. But the early frost was not the real disaster. The real disaster came 3 days later, when the temperature dropped again and stayed low, and a blizzard swept down from Canada that buried the prairie under 3 feet of snow before November had even begun. It was the worst winter anyone in the territory could remember. The cattle froze where they stood. The trains stopped running. The roads disappeared under drifts that reached the eaves of the cabins. Ada stayed inside, burning the wood she had stacked, feeding the animals, and reading the journal by lamplight. The first month was hard, but manageable. The second month was harder. By the third month, she had run out of coffee, and the flour was down to the last sack, and the milk cow had stopped giving altogether. She began to ration everything, measuring each meal with the careful precision of a woman who knew that the margin between survival and failure was as thin as the shell of an egg. And then, in late February, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Orville Grimes standing in the snow, his face frostbitten, his horse standing behind him with its head low and its flanks heaving. He had ridden through the blizzard to reach her, and he had something to say. He stumbled into the cabin, and she helped him to the fire, and she gave him water and a blanket. He sat there for a long time, shivering, before he spoke. His voice was hoarse. "The land office has made a decision on your claim," he said. "They're reducing it to 8 acres, effective this spring. The rest will be opened for relocation." Ada listened, and she felt the words land on her like a second winter. She did not argue. She did not cry. She sat down across from him, and she looked at the fire, and she said, "I will write to the commissioner." He nodded, and he stayed until the storm passed, and then he rode away, and Ada was alone with the weight of what was coming. But that night, as she sat in the cabin, the fire low and the wind howling outside, she heard something. A sound that did not belong to the storm. It was the sound of a wagon, creaking through the snow, coming closer. She got up and opened the door, and she saw a lantern swinging in the dark. And a voice called out to her, a voice she recognized. It was Martha Sutter, bundled in furs, driving a wagon loaded with sacks of flour, dried beans, and a side of salted pork. Behind her, Caleb Sutter rode on horseback, leading a second team. They had come through the blizzard to bring her supplies, and behind them, in the light of the lantern, she saw more wagons, more neighbors, more faces she did not entirely know. They had heard about the reduction, and they had come to remind her that she was not alone. The neighbors came through the snow with their wagons, their lanterns swinging in the dark like a procession of small, stubborn stars. Ada stood in the open doorway, the wind whipping her hair across her face, and she watched them emerge from the white. Martha Sutter first, then her father Caleb, then 3 other families she had helped with seed or advice over the past 2 seasons. They carried flour and dried beans and salted pork and a side of beef wrapped in canvas, and they stacked it all on her porch without a word of explanation, as if bringing supplies through a blizzard were the most ordinary thing in the world. Martha took Ada's hands in hers, and her fingers were cold even through the mittens, and she said, "You gave us the seed. This is the least we could do." Ada could not speak. She stood there, the snow collecting on her shoulders, and she felt something break open inside her that had been frozen for a very long time. The winter broke in March, not with a gentle thaw, but with a sudden, violent warmth that turned the snow to slush and the roads to rivers of mud. The creeks swelled and overflowed, and the prairie emerged from under the white like a patient animal shaking itself awake. Ada walked the south field as soon as the ground was firm enough to hold her weight, and she found it changed. The snow had protected it, and the soil beneath was dark and soft, holding the moisture it would need for the season ahead. She knelt and pressed her hand into it, and she felt the life there, the patient turning of roots and worms, and the slow chemistry of decay and renewal. She had been told she would lose half of it, and she had made her peace with that, but she had not stopped believing in what the ground could do. Orville Grimes returned in April, on a morning when the sky was the color of a robin's egg and the air smelled of wet earth. He did not ride a horse this time. He came on foot, walking the 3 miles from town with a leather satchel over his shoulder, his boots caked with mud. Ada saw him coming from the porch, and she set down the bucket she was carrying and waited. He stopped at the fence line and stood there for a moment, looking at the south field. The clover she had planted the previous fall on the fallow strip had survived the winter and was already showing green. The rest of the field was bare, waiting for the corn. He did not speak for a long time. Then he opened his satchel and took out a letter, and he handed it to her across the fence. It was from the Territorial Land Office, signed by the commissioner himself. The letter stated that after review of her improvement records and the testimony of neighboring landowners, the reduction order had been rescinded. The full 16 acres would remain her claim. The letter noted that the office had received correspondence from no fewer than 7 farmers in the district, attesting to the quality of her land and the effectiveness of her methods. Ada read the letter twice, and then she looked up at Orville Grimes. He was not smiling. But something in his face had softened, the way ice softens when the current moves beneath it. He said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I have a confession to make. I wrote that report because I thought I knew what good farming looked like. I thought a woman alone couldn't possibly understand what a man with 40 years of experience couldn't figure out. I was wrong. I've seen your corn. I've seen what happens to the soil after you've worked it. I'm not too proud to say I was wrong." Ada folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She said, "Mr. Grimes, I accept your apology. And I would be happy to show you how the clover works, if you have time to learn." He stood there a moment longer, and then he nodded, and he turned and walked back down the road. She watched him go, and she felt the weight of the winter lift from her shoulders, not all at once, but in pieces, like a coat being unbuttoned 1 button at a time. She planted the corn in the 3rd week of April, the whole 16 acres, using seed saved from the best ears of the previous 2 harvests. The ground was ready, and the weather held, and the germination came within a week. She walked the rows each morning, and she wrote in her journal, and she watched the green carpet of seedlings spread across the field like a slow tide. By the middle of May, the corn was past her knee, and by the 1st of June it was waist-high, the stalks thick and the leaves broad. The field was a solid wall of green, and it hummed with the sound of growing. But something was wrong with the rest of the county. It started with a whisper, the way most disasters do. A farmer to the west noticed that his early wheat had developed an odd rust-colored powder on the lower leaves. Within a week, the rust had spread to his corn. Within 2 weeks it had jumped to the next farm, and the next, moving through the fields like a slow, patient fire. The leaves turned orange, then brown, then black, and the ears stopped filling. The crop that had looked so promising in May became a tragedy by July. The men gathered at Pruitt's store, and their voices were low and tight, and they spoke of ruin and debt and the long walk to the bank. The rust was unlike anything they had seen before. It did not respond to the usual remedies. It traveled on the wind, and it found every field of conventional corn within a radius of 30 miles. But it did not find Ada's field. She noticed the rust in mid-June, a faint orange dust on the lower leaves of the corn at the western edge. She ran her fingers over it, and she felt her heart drop. She had seen rust before, in Ohio, and she knew what it could do. She walked the field for hours, examining every row, and she found that the rust was there, but it was not spreading. It had appeared on a handful of leaves near the edge, but it had stopped there, as though the plant itself had refused to accept it. The soil, the thick, rich soil that Einar Holt's Clover had built, was producing corn that was simply too strong to succumb. She checked the field every day, and the rust remained contained, a few orange spots that never grew, never spread, never took hold. By the time July arrived, the rust had disappeared entirely, burned off by the sun, or defeated by the health of the plants. But the rest of the county was not so fortunate. Caleb Sutter's corn, which had been planted on ground restored with Ada's clover seed, showed only a mild case of rust that did not damage the yield. But the farms that had not used her method were devastated. Harold Pruitt's field, which he had planted the previous year with clover on Ada's advice, had not yet completed a full rotation. He had only just turned the clover under that spring, and the corn was still establishing its roots. The rust found his field, and it took half his crop. He came to Ada in late July, his face gray with worry, and he said, "I should have listened to you earlier. I thought I knew better. I lost acres I couldn't afford to lose." Ada looked at him, and she did not say, "I told you so." She said, "Plant clover again this fall. Leave it for the whole season next year. The soil needs time, but it will heal." It was Hilda Mears who broke last. Her husband's wheat had been ravaged by the rust, and the corn on their 200 acres was a total loss. She came to Ada's cabin on a Sunday afternoon, driving her own buggy, alone. She sat at the table, and she did not look at Ada. She stared at her hands. She said, "I have 2 daughters. One of them wants to farm. She asked me if she could plant clover on the fallow ground, like you do. I told her no. I told her it was folly." She stopped, and her voice cracked. "I was wrong. I was wrong, and I don't know how to say that without feeling like I have lost everything." Ada reached across the table and took her hand. She said, "You haven't lost everything. You have the soil. You have your daughters. You have the knowledge now. That is more than most people ever have." Hilda Mears did not apologize in the way Orville Grimes had apologized. She did not use the words, "I was wrong," but she let Ada's hand remain on hers, and she bowed her head, and the silence between them was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 women who understood that the ground did not care about reputation or pride. The ground cared only about what was given back to it. When Hilda left, she took a sack of clover seed from Ada's shelf, and she did not ask for it. She simply took it, and Ada let her. By August, the rust had run its course, and the county took stock of what was left. The conventional fields had lost between half and 3/4 of their expected yield. The fields that had been treated with Ada's method, or with her seed, had lost almost nothing. The difference was not subtle. It was visible from the road, a line of green against a sea of brown. The farmers who had mocked Ada in 1887 now drove past her field with a different look in their eyes. Not admiration exactly, but a kind of quiet respect that was harder to earn and more valuable than praise. Orville Grimes came again in September, not as a land agent, but as a man seeking advice. He had inherited a small farm from an uncle, and the soil was thin and tired. He brought a pencil and paper, and he sat at Ada's table and took notes as she explained the method. He asked about the depth of the clover roots, the timing of the turning, the varieties of corn that performed best afterward. She answered each question patiently, and when he left, he shook her hand, and he said, "I'll be planting clover this fall. I'll let you know how it goes." The harvest that autumn was not the largest Ada had ever seen, but it was the most satisfying. The ears were full and heavy, the kernels deep and golden, and the barn filled to the rafters. She saved enough seed to give to every farmer who asked, and she wrote letters to the Territorial Agricultural Society, describing the method in detail. She received a reply in November, not from the society but from a man named Professor Aldrich, who taught at the Agricultural College in Brookings. He had heard of her work through a neighbor's son who was a student there. He asked if she would write an article for the college's journal. She did not write the article. She sent him Einar Holt's journal instead, with a note that said, "The credit belongs to a man who learned to listen before I was born." That winter was milder than the one before. The snow came and went, and the cabin stayed warm, and Ada slept through the nights without waking to the sound of wind. She wrote in her journal less often now because the urgency had gone out of her life, and the days were full of quiet, steady work that did not need to be recorded. But she still walked to the south field on clear mornings, even when the ground was frozen, even when the snow covered it. She would stand at the fence line, her hands deep in her pockets, and she would look at the white expanse, knowing what lay beneath it. It was on one of those mornings, in early February, that she saw a figure moving across the field from the road. It was a young woman, bundled in a heavy coat, her face hidden by a scarf. She reached the fence and stopped, and she unwound the scarf to reveal a face that Ada recognized. It was the daughter of a homesteader who had taken her clover seed the previous spring. The girl could not have been more than 19, but her eyes held the same look that Ada's had held 7 years before, a mixture of exhaustion and stubborn hope. She said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I need your help. My father says the clover is a waste of good ground. He says I'm following a fool's story. But I saw your field last summer. I know what I saw. Can you tell me again how it works?" Ada looked at her, and she felt the story rise in her chest. The same story she had told 100 times. The same story that never got old because it contained the one truth that mattered. She stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in," she said. "I'll show you the journal." The girl stepped across the threshold, and the wind caught the door and pushed it shut behind her. Outside, the south field lay silent under the snow, waiting for the spring, waiting for the seed, waiting for the next woman who would learn to listen. The girl sat at Ada's table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had not yet touched. Her name was Ruth Parsons, and she had come 11 miles on foot through the February cold because she had nowhere else to go. Her father, a man named Ezra Parsons, had brought the family from Indiana 3 years before, chasing the promise of cheap land and a fresh start. The promise had not kept itself. The soil on their claim was thin and gravelly, and every crop they had planted had come up weak and yellow. Ruth had watched her mother's face grow thinner each season, and she had watched her father's hands grow more clenched. She had seen Ada's field the previous summer from the road, and she had not forgotten it. She had dreamed of it, she said, the tall green stalks standing against the pale sky like something impossible made real. Ada set Einar Holt's journal on the table between them. She did not open it right away. She let Ruth look at the worn leather cover, the faded spine, the way the pages bulged from years of use. Then she opened it to the first entry and began to read aloud, slowly, the way a person reads a letter they have memorized but still want to hear again. She read about the winter of 1882, about the dead soil, about the old man who had come through the snow with a crate of seed. She read about the first green shoots, the earthworms, the smell of the turned clover. She read the entry from July of 1883, where Einar Holt had written, "The bees came today. The field sounded like a living thing." Ruth listened without moving, her tea growing cold in her hands. When Ada finished, she closed the journal and slid it across the table. Ruth took it, her fingers brushing the cover as if she were touching something sacred. She said, "My father will not believe this. He says the only thing that saves land is manure and patience. He says clover is for cows, not for farming." Ada nodded. She had heard those words before, from other men, from women, from herself in the years before she had learned to trust what she could not see. She said, "Your father does not have to believe it. But the ground will. The ground does not argue. It only responds." Ruth stayed until the light began to fade, and then she wrapped her scarf around her face and stepped back into the cold. Ada watched her walk down the road, a small figure against the white expanse, and she wondered whether the girl would have the courage to act on what she had learned. She had seen that look before, in young women who came to her door with questions and left with a handful of seed. Some of them planted it. Some of them let it sit in a drawer until it was too old to germinate. The difference between the two was not knowledge, it was faith. The spring came early that year, the snow melting in March, the ground warming faster than Ada could remember. She planted her corn on the 1st of April, a week earlier than usual, because the soil felt ready, and she had learned to trust that feeling. The seed went in clean, and the rain came soft and steady, and by the middle of the month, the field was covered in a low green fuzz that thickened day by day. She walked the rows each morning, her boots leaving prints in the dark soil, and she felt the old quiet joy rising in her chest, the joy of watching something grow that she had helped to begin. Ruth Parsons returned in the 3rd week of April, riding a mule and leading a pack horse loaded with bags of clover seed. She had bought it with money she had earned by taking in washing, and she had hidden it from her father because she knew he would forbid it. She asked Ada to help her plant it, not because she did not know how, but because she needed someone to stand beside her while she did it, to witness the act and to confirm that it was not foolishness. Ada saddled her horse and rode the 11 miles to the Parsons claim, and she found a field of pale, thin soil that looked exactly like her own south field had looked in 1883. She stood at the edge while Ruth scattered the seed, her arms swinging in wide arcs, the small red grains falling against the gray earth like a promise. They worked until the light was gone, and then Ada rode home in the dark, tired and content. The clover came up, as it always did, slow at first and then steady. Ruth sent word through a neighbor that the field was showing green, and Ada smiled when she heard it. She knew what that first green meant. It meant the ground had accepted the gift. It meant the long work of healing had begun. The summer that followed was the most beautiful Ada could remember. The rain came at regular intervals, the temperatures stayed moderate, and the corn grew with a vigor that made her stop and stare sometimes, standing at the edge of the field with her hands on her hips, shaking her head. The stalks reached above her head by the 4th of July, and by the middle of the month they were so tall and dense that the field had become a private world, a green cathedral that hummed with the sound of growing. She walked into it one afternoon, the leaves brushing her shoulders, and she found a small clearing where the corn had grown in a perfect circle, leaving a patch of ground open to the sky. She sat down in the center of it, the soil warm and dark beneath her, and she looked up at the blue sky through the ring of green, and she thought about Einar Holt. She thought about the night he had come to her door, carrying the crate, his hands shaking from the cold. She thought about the faith it must have taken for him to give away what he had spent a lifetime learning, to trust that a woman he barely knew would carry it forward. She said his name aloud, in the quiet of the field, and she thanked him. The locusts came on the 20th of August. Ada heard them before she saw them, a low, grinding sound that rose from the horizon like the approach of a distant storm. She was in the barn, mending a harness, and she stepped outside to find the sky darkening to the east, not with clouds, but with a living, moving mass that blotted out the sun. She had seen locusts before, in Ohio, when she was a girl, but she had never seen a swarm like this. It stretched from one end of the sky to the other, and the sound of it was not like thunder or wind. It was like the sound of a million small jaws working, a dry, endless chewing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She ran to the field. The corn stood tall and green, the ears full and heavy, and the swarm was descending on it. The locusts landed on the stalks, covered the leaves, clung to the ears. They were everywhere, a living blanket that moved and shifted and ate. Ada stood at the edge of the field, and she could not move. She watched the locusts cover her corn, and she felt the years of work collapsing into a single moment of destruction. She thought about the winter of 1887, about the drought, about the rust, about every obstacle she had faced and overcome. And she thought that this time, perhaps, she had finally met the one thing she could not beat. The locusts fed for 3 days. They moved through the county like a plague out of Scripture, stripping every field of corn, every garden, every patch of green that stood in their path. When they left behind a landscape that looked like a burned photograph, gray and still and empty. The cornfields that had been lush and alive were now nothing but bare stalks, the leaves gone, the ears hollowed out. The gardens were patches of bare earth, the vines hanging like dead ropes. The farmers stood in their fields and did not speak. There was nothing to say. Ada walked to her south field on the morning of the 4th day. She had not looked at it since the swarm arrived, because she had not been able to bear it. She walked slowly, her boots crunching on the dry ground, and she reached the edge of the field and stopped. The corn was still standing. The stalks were still green. The locusts had come, and they had fed, but they had not destroyed it. The leaves were ragged, eaten at the edges, but the ears were intact. The stalks were whole. The field was damaged, but it was alive. She walked into it, and she saw that the locusts had taken perhaps 1/10 of the leaves, but the corn itself had survived. The soil, rich and dark and full of life, had produced plants that were strong enough to withstand the swarm. The locusts had moved on because the corn was not weak enough to satisfy them. Ada stood in the middle of the field, surrounded by the tattered but living stalks, and she felt a wave of emotion that she could not name. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something deeper, something that had to do with the long, slow work of trust, the kind of trust that does not ask for proof before it acts. She knelt and put her hand on the soil, and she felt the cool, dark crumble of it beneath her fingers. The soil had saved the corn. The clover had saved the soil. And Einar Holt, who had died before he could see what he had started, had saved them all. The news spread through the county within a day. Every conventional field had been stripped bare. The farmers who had not used the clover method had lost everything. The farmers who had followed Ada's example, who had planted clover and turned it under and built their soil, had fields that were damaged but not destroyed. Caleb Sutter's corn, planted on ground that had been restored with Ada's seed, had lost 1/4 of its leaves but held its ears. Ruth Parsons's clover field was gone, eaten to the ground, but the roots were intact, and the soil beneath it was alive. She came to Ada that evening, her face streaked with tears, and she said, "It's gone, all of it." Ada took her hands and said, "The clover is gone, but the soil is not. The roots are still there. The earthworms are still there. You can plant it again next year, and it will come back stronger. The ground remembers." The men gathered at Pruitt's store that night, and the talk was of ruin and leaving, of selling out and moving west. Harold Pruitt stood behind his counter, his face gray, his hands trembling. He had lost his entire corn crop, and the store was running low on credit. He looked up when Ada walked in, and the room fell silent. She did not say much. She stood at the counter, and she said, "I have seed corn saved from last year. I have enough to share. I have clover seed for anyone who wants to start over. It will take time, but the ground can heal. I have seen it." The men looked at her, and the silence stretched out. And then one of them, a man named Theodore Vance, who had been among the loudest mockers in 1887, said, "Ada, we owe you an apology. You were right, and we were wrong. Tell us what to do." Theodore Vance's words hung in the air of Pruitt's store like smoke from a lamp that had just been blown out. Ada stood at the counter, her hands resting on the worn wood, and she looked at the men gathered there. their faces drawn, their shoulders slumped, their fields stripped bare. She did not feel triumph. She felt the weight of their loss as though it were her own, because she had stood where they stood, 7 years before, looking at ground that had given everything and had nothing left to give. She said, "We start tomorrow. I have seed in the barn. I have clover seed for anyone who wants it. We will plant the fallow fields and let the ground rest through the winter, and in the spring we will plant again. It will take time, but the soil will heal." No one argued, no one laughed. Harold Pruitt came around from behind the counter and took off his apron, and he said, "I'll drive my wagon out to your place at first light. I'll bring whatever else you need." The men nodded, and they filed out into the evening, and Ada stood alone in the store for a moment, listening to the silence that had settled over the town. She walked home through the prairie dark, the stars coming out one by one, and the south field lay quiet and patient, its tattered corn standing like a testament to something she had not fully understood until now. The work of recovery began the next morning. Ada rose before dawn and opened the barn, and she found Harold Pruitt already there, his wagon loaded with empty sacks. They spent the morning sorting the seed corn, separating the best ears for planting from those that would be ground for meal. By noon, the first neighbors had arrived: Caleb Sutter, Theodore Vance, 2 brothers from the north who had lost everything but still showed up with their hands ready. Ada gave them clover seed for the fields that had been stripped, and she showed them how to scatter it, how to trust the process even when the ground looked dead. Ruth Parsons came with her father, Ezra, who had not spoken to Ada in 3 years. He stood at the edge of the group, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Ruth went to him and took his hand, and she led him to Ada. He looked at her, and he said, "I don't understand how it works, but I saw your field. I saw what the locusts left behind. I'll plant the clover." Ada gave him a sack of seed, and he carried it to his wagon without another word. Hilda Mears came on the 3rd day. She drove her buggy up to Ada's cabin, and she sat in the seat for a long moment before she climbed down. Her dress was plain, without the lace and ribbons she usually wore to town. Her hair was pulled back tight. She walked to Ada's porch, and she stood there with her hands clasped in front of her, and she said, "Ada Whitaker, I have come to say something I should have said a long time ago." Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. "I was wrong. I told my daughters that your method was foolishness. I told them that a woman alone could not know more than the men who had farmed this land for generations. I have spent the past week watching my husband walk through fields that are nothing but dirt and stubble, and I have watched your corn still standing. I have no right to ask for your help, but I am asking anyway. My youngest daughter, the one who wanted to plant clover, she has not spoken to me since the locusts came. She said I should have listened to you." She is right. Ada looked at Hilda Mears, and she saw the woman beneath the pride, the mother who had been afraid of being wrong, afraid of losing her place in the community, afraid of admitting that her certainties were built on sand. Ada said, "I have clover seed. I have enough for your fallow field, and I have a journal you can read if you want to understand how it works." Hilda Mears did not answer with words. She reached out and took Ada's hand, and she held it for a moment, and then she let go. They walked together to the barn, and Ada gave her a sack of clover seed, and Hilda Mears carried it to her buggy with both arms, the way a woman carries something precious. The winter that followed was not harsh. The snow came and went, and the cold stayed moderate, and the clover seed that had been scattered across the county lay beneath the white, doing its slow, invisible work. Ada spent the months reading and mending and writing in her journal, but her entries had changed. They were no longer records of struggle and measurement. They were reflections, observations, the thoughts of a woman who had learned to trust the ground and had seen that trust rewarded. She wrote about the locusts, about the moment she had stood at the edge of the field and thought she had lost everything, only to find that the soil had held. She wrote about Einar Holt, and she wrote about the young women who had come to her door, Ruth and Martha, and others whose names she was already forgetting. She wrote, "The work is not mine alone. It was never mine alone. It belongs to everyone who has ever put seed in the ground and waited. In the spring of 1891, Ada planted her corn on the south field for the 8th time. The soil was darker than it had ever been, the crumb loose and rich, the smell of it rising like a promise. She planted the whole 16 acres, and the germination came in 6 days, faster than she had ever seen. By June, the corn was shoulder high. By July, it was taller than she could reach. The field was a forest of green, so dense that she could walk into it and disappear. And she did, almost every evening, sitting in the clearing that had become her sanctuary, listening to the corn sing. The harvest that autumn was the largest in the history of the county. The yield was nearly double the average of the conventional fields that had been restored with clover, and those fields themselves were producing more than they had in years. The farmers who had followed Ada's method brought their crops to the mill, and the miller said he had never seen corn of that quality outside of the river bottomlands. The word spread. Professor Aldrich from the Agricultural College came to visit in October, driving a buggy with a brass nameplate on the side. He spent 3 days with Ada, walking the fields, reading her journals, asking questions that she answered with the same patient thoroughness she had used with Ruth Parsons. He left with a copy of Einar Holt's journal, which Ada had asked a traveling photographer to duplicate page by page at the county seat. He said he would have it published in the college's bulletin. Ada told him to credit Einar Holt. The recognition came slowly, the way recognition always comes to people who have not sought it. The Territorial Agricultural Society awarded Ada a certificate of merit, which she framed and hung beside the window where the morning light caught it. The local newspaper ran an article about her titled, "The Woman Who Saved the County," and she hated the title, but did not say so because she knew the reporter meant well. The governor of the territory wrote her a letter, thanking her for her contributions to the advancement of prairie agriculture. She tucked the letter into the back of Einar Holt's journal, between the last page and the cover, where it would not be lost. But the recognition that mattered most came from the people who had once laughed at her. They came to her door in the evenings, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, and they sat at her table and they asked her questions. They brought their children, their grandchildren, the young ones who would inherit the land. They sat and listened to her speak about red clover and earthworms and the long patience of healthy soil, and they watched her hands as she turned the pages of the journal, and they went home carrying something that was not just knowledge. It was the story of a woman who had been at her lowest and had chosen to trust what she could not see, and that story changed them. Hilda Mears came one last time on a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1892, with her youngest daughter beside her. The daughter was 17 now, with steady hands and the same quiet, observant way of moving that Ada recognized from her own youth. She carried a jar of honey wrapped in a cloth, and she set it on Ada's table. Hilda said, "My daughter wants to learn. She wants to plant her own field. I told her she could start with the fallow ground behind the barn." She paused, and her voice dropped. "I told her you would be the one to teach her." Ada looked at the girl, and she saw Ruth Parsons in her, and Martha Sutter, and all the others who had come to her door with the same look. The look of someone who had heard a different story about what the land could do and wanted to believe it. Ada said, "Bring her tomorrow. I will show her how to read the soil." The girl smiled, and Hilda Mears put her hand on her daughter's shoulder, and for the first time in all the years Ada had known her, she did not look afraid. That evening, Ada sat on her porch and watched the sun set over the south field. The corn had been planted a week before, and the first green shoots were just beginning to show, a faint haze across the dark soil. She held Einar Holt's journal in her hands, the leather soft from years of handling, the pages worn thin at the edges. She opened it to the final entry, the one he had written in the winter before he died, when his handwriting had grown unsteady and his thoughts had turned to the end. It said, "I have given what I could. The ground will remember." Ada traced the words with her finger, and she thought about how the ground did remember. It remembered the clover, the worms, the patient turning of the seasons. It remembered the hands that had worked it, the feet that had walked it, the seed that had been trusted to its keeping. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned orange and pink, and then a deep, slow purple. Ada closed the journal and held it against her chest. She looked out at the field, and she saw the small green shoots catching the last light, and she thought of all the years that had brought her to this moment. The winter of 1887, the blizzard, the drought, the rust, the locusts, the mockery, the doubt, the loneliness. She thought of Einar Holt walking through the snow to her door, carrying a crate of seed and a journal that would change everything. She thought of Ruth Parsons riding a mule 11 miles with clover seed hidden in her saddlebags. She thought of Hilda Mears standing on her porch with her hands trembling, saying the words she had been afraid to say. And she thought of the ground itself, dark and patient and full of memory, holding everything that had been given to it and giving it back in its own time. She rose from the porch and walked down to the fence line. The air was cool and quiet, and the only sound was the distant call of a meadowlark. She knelt at the edge of the field, and she pressed her hand flat against the soil. It was warm from the day's sun, soft and crumbly beneath her fingers. She stayed there for a long time, her hand on the ground, feeling the small lives moving beneath the surface, the worms turning, the roots reaching, the seed waiting. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her hand, and walked back to the cabin. She placed Einar Holt's journal on the shelf beside her own, and she lit the lamp and sat down at the table. She opened her journal to a fresh page, the paper blank and waiting, and she wrote in her careful, unhurried hand, "The ground keeps its promises. I have learned that, and I will spend the rest of my life teaching it to anyone who will listen. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows."